Tonight, we begin a 3-hour journey into gentle Buddhist stories designed to carry you out of the day's tension and into deep, restful quiet. There is nothing to master, no lesson to memorize. These are quiet parables from the Zen tradition. A young monk carrying the weight of the world. A master accused of fathering a child who answers only, "Is that so?" A stone that seems to demand everything from the one who holds it. Each story works beneath the surface, softening the grip of worry and guiding your attention back to the peace that has always been waiting inside you. So settle in, breathe, and let the night become your teacher. To understand why these stories carry such a quiet power, we need to go back to their source. Zen is not a philosophy to be debated. It is a practice of waking up to the life that is already here. For more than 1,000 years, its teachers have used stories the way a physician uses medicine, not to entertain, but to heal a specific confusion in the listener. The tale of a monk carrying a stone, or a master accused of fathering a child, is not merely a legend. It is a carefully shaped instrument designed to reach a part of the mind that ordinary instruction cannot touch. That is the central question of the next 3 hours. How can words from centuries ago loosen the very thing that keeps you awake tonight? The overworked machinery of a mind that does not know how to set itself down. To answer that, we have to look at the soil in which these stories grew. Zen began as a movement within Buddhism that insisted on direct experience over book learning. According to tradition, it arrived in China when an Indian monk named Bodhidharma traveled east around the 6th century. He is said to have sat facing a wall for 9 years, refusing to offer clever answers. His teaching pointed beyond words to the living awareness beneath all thought. From those uncompromising roots, the tradition slowly made its way to Japan, where it took shape in monasteries and mountain temples. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Zen had become a rigorous path of meditation, physical labor, and intimate encounter between master and student. The great names we will meet tonight, Joshu, Nanin, Bankei, Hakuin, were not merely historical decorations. They were real figures who faced the same inner storms we do, and who found startlingly practical ways to work with them. What makes a Zen story different from a normal story is its refusal to satisfy the intellect. A typical tale builds tension and then resolves it with an explanation. A Zen story often builds tension and then takes a sudden turn that leaves the analytical mind with nothing to hold. In the tradition, such stories are called koans, or public cases, and they are not riddles to be solved, but gateways to be passed through. The famous question, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" is not meant to be figured out. It is meant to exhaust the part of you that figures, so that something deeper can surface. When a monk asks a master for the meaning of Buddha, the master might point to a cypress tree or raise a finger. The point is not the answer. The point is the direct seeing that happens when the questioner stops trying to possess the answer. This is precisely why these stories matter tonight. The mind that cannot sleep is often caught in the same loop of trying to solve, control, or resolve. The story that refuses to be solved offers the mind a different possibility. Not victory, but rest. In the remote monasteries where these teaching encounters took place, the relationship between master and student was everything. A young person would leave home and enter a community of silence, routine, and demanding physical work. Monks rose before dawn. They swept floors, chopped wood, carried water, and sat for hours in meditation. The master was not a distant lecturer, but a close observer of each student's patterns. When a student was stuck, the master would not simply give a comforting speech. He might shout, strike, ignore, or assign a task that looked like punishment, but was actually a precise medicine. A student too attached to ritual might be made to wait at the gate for hours. A student too proud of his knowledge might be asked a simple question he could not answer. The setting was harsh, but its purpose was compassion. The master was not trying to break the student. He was trying to help the student see through the false identity that was causing his suffering. This dynamic is the engine behind the first story we will enter tonight, the story of a young monk named Kenji and the burden he did not know he was carrying. Kenji lived in one of those mountain monasteries, surrounded by mist and stone and the sound of wind through cedar branches. He was not a lazy student. In fact, his problem was the opposite. Kenji cared too much. When he heard about a village struck by famine, his appetite disappeared. When he saw an animal injured on the path, he would spend hours trying to help, even when his own duties suffered. At night, while the other monks slept, Kenji lay awake with images turning in his mind: children crying, families fleeing, bodies broken by war and sickness. He prayed for all beings, but the prayers became tangled with fear. The weight of the world seemed to settle on his chest, and the more he tried to release it through worry, the heavier it grew. His master, an old monk named Tanaka, noticed the shadows under Kenji's eyes. He did not scold him for being too soft. He understood something that Kenji had not yet learned. Compassion without wisdom can become a form of suffering. The same sensitivity that allows us to feel another's pain can also smother us if we do not know how to let that pain move through us and return to stillness. Tanaka watched Kenji through several weeks of declining appetite and fitful sleep. He saw the young monk rushing from one chore to the next, as if speed could outrun the images in his mind. And then, one morning, after meditation, Tanaka called Kenji aside and said only, "Come with me." They walked in silence down a rocky path behind the monastery, past the woodpile and the garden, until they reached a dry riverbed. Tanaka scanned the ground and picked up a stone the size of a human head. It was heavy, rough-edged, flecked with mica that caught the morning light. Without explanation, he placed it into Kenji's arms. "Carry this for the rest of the day," he said. "Do not set it down, no matter what you are doing. When you eat, carry it. When you work, carry it. When you sit, hold it in your lap. And when you sleep tonight, if you sleep, keep it beside you." Then Tanaka turned and walked back toward the gate. Kenji stood there, confused. The stone pressed against his ribs. He wanted to ask why, but the master had not given him room for questions. So he obeyed. At first, it was not difficult. The stone had a solid, almost reassuring weight. But within an hour, his arms began to ache. By midday, the strain had spread to his shoulders and neck. Every time he shifted his grip, the stone seemed to grow more awkward, more unmanageable. Other monks glanced at him with curiosity, but they said nothing. Kenji began to understand something uncomfortable. The stone was no longer just a stone. It was a demand. It was the memory of every hungry child, every broken body, every injustice he had absorbed. And Tanaka had told him to carry it. That is where we leave the first movement, with a young man holding a stone he does not yet know how to put down. The weight in his arms is real, but it is also a mirror of the weight he has been carrying invisibly for months. What his master is doing is not cruelty. It is the beginning of a teaching that will reach far beyond this one evening. The stone is not the enemy. The enemy is the gripping, the refusal to let go, the belief that if he holds on hard enough, he can somehow make the world whole. That belief is what keeps so many of us awake. And the first step toward rest is not to ignore the burden. It is to see it clearly. By the time the midday meal was called, the stone had already become a pulse at the center of Kenji's awareness. He carried it into the kitchen because Tanaka's instruction had been absolute. With one arm he held the stone. With the other he tried to lift his bowl of rice. Both were unsteady. Broth spilled across his hand, and the stone shifted hard against his ribs. The other monks said nothing. Some glanced at him, and then looked back at their food. A few watched with quiet patience. No one offered to help, not because they were cruel, but because they understood that in this monastery, an assignment from the master was not a correction. It was medicine, and medicine does not always taste sweet. But silence has a way of becoming its own pressure. All afternoon, Kenji looked for Tanaka in the courtyard, by the gate near the meditation hall. He wanted some sign that the task would end, some nod of approval. Tanaka gave him none. He passed by with his hands folded, his face as unreadable as frost on stone. That absence of guidance did something unexpected. It turned the weight from a physical burden into a question. Why this? Why now? Kenji had been absorbing the pain of the world for months, and Tanaka had responded not with comfort, but with a rock. The unfairness of it began to burn beneath his fatigue. The more he wanted relief, the more the lesson tightened around him. At the woodpile, the true breaking point began. His daily work required both hands. He squatted and tried to stack split cedar while balancing the stone beneath one arm. The wood slipped. He caught the stone before it rolled, but the rough bark scraped his forearm raw. He drew a sharp breath. He wanted to throw the thing down, to demand an explanation, to scream at the master for seeing his pain and adding more. But he did not. Instead, he whispered a vow through clenched teeth. He would carry it. He would prove that he could bear the weight of the world and still serve. That determination came not only from compassion, it came from pride, and he could not yet see the difference. A young novice passed by with a wooden bucket of water. He paused and started to speak, but Kenji shook his head. He did not want help. He wanted to be the one who carried without complaint. That refusal of help became another layer of the burden. The stone was no longer simply heavy. It was the story of his own worth, measured by how much suffering he could absorb. If he set it down, he would be weak. If he asked for help, he would be useless. So he held on, and the pain grew into a dark, quietly furious endurance. At evening, sutras he sat with the stone in his lap. The chant moved through the hall in slow waves, and for a few minutes his voice joined the others. The vibration softened the knot in his chest just enough to give him hope. Then the chant ended, and the stone was still there. He lifted it again, and the full force of the day pressed into his lower back. The brief peace collapsed. He looked around the hall at the other monks, and for the first time he felt separate from them. They rested in ordinary bodies, unburdened by his mission. He resented them for it. That resentment surprised him. It was a new kind of heaviness, not from the world, but from the isolation his own effort had created. Night arrived, but no release came with it. Kenji carried the stone to his sleeping mat and knelt beside it while the others lay down. Their breathing soon settled into the long, slow rhythm of sleep. Kenji could not settle. Every position pressed the stone's mass against some new tender point. His neck ached, his knees ached. His arms trembled with small, involuntary spasms. In the darkness, the images returned. Children in the famine, wounded animals, families fleeing through smoke. The stone seemed to grow heavier with each face, as if the suffering of the world was entering him again, drop by drop. He realized with horror that he had spent the whole day carrying a boulder, while his mind had continued doing exactly what it had always done, gripping the world and refusing to let go. Sometime after midnight, he could bear it no longer. He rose and carried the stone towards the small meditation hall where a lamp still burned. Tanaka was there, seated before the altar, motionless. Kenji knelt at the threshold with the stone pressed against his stomach. His voice came out hoarse. "Master, I cannot carry it any more." He expected mercy, or at least an explanation. Tanaka turned and looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said, "Put it down." The instruction was so simple that Kenji did not move at first. Then, slowly, he lowered the stone to the wooden floor. The relief was immediate. His arms rose without weight, and a strange, painful laugh escaped him. But Tanaka did not laugh. He did not tell him to rest. He only pointed at the stone and asked, "What did you put down?" Kenji opened his mouth. The words collapsed. In that instant, the first true turning point arrived. The stone was lying on the floor, but its weight had not left him. His hands were empty, yet the mass of the world still pressed against his chest. The starving children, the wounded creatures, the endless demand to fix what could not be fixed, all of it remained. The burden had never been the rock. It was his refusal to set down the world and allow it to exist without his agony. Knowing that, however, was not freedom. It was only the doorway. Tanaka leaned forward, and his question cut through the lamplight. "What are you still carrying?" Kenji could not answer. The story had brought him to the edge of a revelation that would require the rest of the night and the deep current of Zen itself to cross. Kenji did not sleep that night. The stone sat by the doorway of the meditation hall, a lump of cold shadow, but the question Tanaka had asked remained inside him like a splinter. He had put the rock down, his arms were empty, and yet he could still feel the weight of the world exactly where it had been before, pressing against his sternum, thickening his breath. So he did what many sincere students do when a teaching becomes too sharp. He tried to solve it with effort. By dawn, he had formed a plan. If carrying the world had caused his suffering, then he would simply stop carrying it. He would not allow himself to care so much. He would keep his attention narrow, perform his duties, and refuse to let the world enter his heart. He rose with the bell, bowed to the altar, and walked through the morning mist with a new kind of distance. When a monk stumbled under a load of firewood, Kenji did not reach out. When an injured bird fluttered in the garden, he looked away. He told himself this was wisdom, that he was practicing the release Tanaka had shown him. But the peace he expected did not come. For 3 days, Kenji moved through the monastery like a man covered in frost. He was efficient. He was calm on the surface. But at night, a cold hollowness opened beneath his ribs. He had not let go of the world. He had only built a wall against it. The suffering outside was still there, but now it was joined by a new suffering, the knowledge that he had cut himself off from compassion. He had traded one prison for another. When Tanaka found him sitting alone by the dry riverbed, the master did not ask about the stone. He only said, "You set down the stone and picked up a shield." Kenji looked up, exhausted. "How do I set down the shield?" he asked. Tanaka picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the riverbed. "You don't set it down," he said. "You stop separating yourself from what you were trying to hold." This was not a solution. It was a doorway. The first story had exposed one layer of Kenji's grasping. Now it exposed another. The world was never the burden. His image of himself as the one who must carry it, or the one who must refuse to carry it, was the burden. The problem was not feeling. The problem was the solidifying of a self that either clung to feeling or fled from it. That insight would ripple through the rest of the night, but it was only the beginning. Zen never leaves a student with a single lesson. It keeps turning the jewel, and each turn reveals darker flaws inside the light. The second story in the tradition presses this same point from a different angle. It is the story of a monk named Hogen and his long search for recognition from a master named Joshu. Hogen had not come to the monastery to learn peace. He had come to be acknowledged. For years he had studied with minor teachers, and each time he left dissatisfied because no one had told him he was ready. He carried a secret question beneath his robes. Was he a real monk or only someone pretending? The question was not about truth. It was about worth. When Hogen arrived at Joshu's temple, he expected to find the confirmation he had been denied elsewhere. Joshu was famous, ancient, unsparing. Surely his approval would settle the matter, but Joshu did not even glance at him during morning practice. Days passed. Hogen sat, worked, and waited. He approached the master after evening sutras and said, "I have been practicing for 9 years. I have crossed mountains to see you. Please teach me." Joshu looked at him and said, "Have you eaten your rice?" Hogen said yes. Joshu said, "Then wash your bowl." Hogen stood there, stunned. This was not the profound teaching he had traveled to receive. It sounded like a dismissal. But in that moment, he missed the entire point. Joshu's instruction was not about the bowl. It was about Hogen's need to be given something more than the ordinary life already in front of him. Hogen continued to seek. He began to list his accomplishments. He had memorized sutras. He had sat for long hours. He had traveled farther than any other student. Each time he spoke, Joshu's face remained still. The old master would simply ask, "Why do you need me to see it?" Hogen could not answer. The need for recognition had become heavier than any meditation cushion. He had turned his spiritual path into a performance, and the audience he most wanted to impress was a master who refused to applaud. The pressure increased when another monk, far younger and less educated, asked Joshu a simple question and received a direct, intimate response. Hogen watched from the corner of the hall and felt something twist in his chest. It was not envy alone. It was fear. If Joshu did not see him, then all those years of striving meant nothing. He began to interrupt the younger monk's conversations. He corrected his pronunciation of sutras. He offered unsolicited interpretations. The other monks noticed. The air around Hogen became brittle. He was no longer seeking liberation. He was fighting to preserve a self-image that had never been real. Then Joshu called him to the garden. They stood before a large stone that had been carved by rain and wind into a shape like a seated figure. Joshu said, "This stone has been here for longer than my life. It does not ask me to recognize it. It does not care whether I call it a stone or a teacher or a god. It is completely itself." He tapped Hogen's chest with one dry finger. "But you are not a stone. You are a man who has turned his own face into a mask and is now asking me to polish it." Hogen's knees buckled. For the first time he saw the pattern. He had never wanted Joshu's teaching. He had wanted Joshu's mirror. The story does not end with an easy breakthrough. Hogan went back to his room and felt the same longing rise again by midnight. Recognition was not a door he could walk through once and leave behind. It was a habit, a groove worn deep by years of seeking. So the monastery and the stories about it treat this as a form of sickness. The cure is not to stop wanting recognition, but to see the one who wants. That turns the story outward into a larger pattern. Kenji had collapsed under the weight of the world because he wanted to be the one who saved it. Hogan had burned with resentment because he wanted to be the one who was seen. Both were caught in the same trap, the creation of a separate self that needed something outside itself to be whole. Now consider what makes this so difficult. We are not speaking of obvious villainy. Kenji's compassion was raw. Hogan's dedication was real. The problem was not the presence of good qualities, but the way the mind took ownership of them. In the language of modern psychology, this is the shift from concern to rumination, from healthy aspiration to anxious self-evaluation. In the language of Zen, it is the shift from original nature to the hungry ghost of self-importance. The teachings do not ask us to become indifferent. They ask us to notice the difference between acting from wholeness and acting to prove that we are whole. That difference is the entire battleground of the next stories. This pattern becomes even sharper in the next traditional encounter, the visit of the governor. A powerful man arrived at a small mountain temple with attendants, silk robes, and the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. He had heard that a master there could answer any question, and he came not as a student, but as an official. His title was his identity. At the gate, the master looked at him and said, "Leave your titles outside. Then you may enter." The governor was insulted. He had traveled with a retinue. Men had cleared the road for him. Now, an old monk in a patched robe was asking him to become no one. The stakes were not physical. They were the power of an entire life, built on rank and authority. For a long moment, the governor did not move. His attendants waited. His face went through several changes, from anger to curiosity to something close to shame. Then, very slowly, he removed the emblems of his office and walked through the gate alone. The title did not disappear, of course. It waited outside with his servants. But inside the temple, it meant nothing. The master served him tea in a cracked cup. The governor asked, "What is the greatest teaching?" The master replied, "The gate you just passed through." The governor frowned. He had expected a philosophical lecture, not a reference to architecture. He had been told the greatest teaching could answer any question. But the master was pointing at the moment before he entered, the moment when he had to choose between his rank and his direct experience of being a man. Where Kenji had gripped the world, and Hogan had gripped recognition, the governor gripped his own public role. All three stories are not separate cases. They are one continuous diagnosis. The world of Zen recounts them not to build a hero, but to expose the ever-shifting strategies of the separate self. Just when a student thinks he has released one form of grasping, another grows in its place. Kenji became cold. Hogan became competitive. The governor resisted the gate. The stakes are not political. They are the entire possibility of rest. A mind that is constantly managing its image, its virtue, its suffering, or its rank cannot sleep. It is always on guard. It is always comparing. It is always carrying something, even when its hands are empty. That is the growing pressure of this part of the journey. We began with a single young monk and a stone. Now, we are looking at a pattern that repeats across centuries and across very different human lives. The first revelation was that the world is not the burden. The compounding revelation is that the self, in its attempt to be righteous, accomplished, or powerful, will keep manufacturing new burdens. No single insight is enough. The tradition therefore uses story after story, each one a mirror angled to catch the next hidden form of grasping. And as the night deepens, these mirrors begin to turn inward. The next question is not what Kenji, Hogan, or the governor should let go of. It is whether the one who wants to let go can ever be found at all. That is the unresolved pressure that will drive the second wave of revelations, and it is far more disturbing than any stone. The unresolved pressure from those three stories is not that Kenji cared too much, or that Hogan wanted to be seen, or that the governor wore his title like skin. The deeper pressure is the one who keeps trying to solve these problems. There is a quiet, almost invisible belief running beneath every version of the story so far, that somewhere inside each person is a stable self that can either hold on or let go, gain recognition or endure its absence, enter the gate as a governor or as a man. The next story does not merely challenge that belief, it collapses it. The story belongs to a nun named Chiono, who lived in the same centuries when the great monasteries were shaping the Zen path. She was not an abbess. She was not a scholar. She worked in a small temple and served the community. But she carried a deep desire to understand the Dharma. For years, she studied with a master named Buko, and for years she practiced with sincere effort. She recited sutras, attended ceremonies, and sat in silence long after others had gone to sleep. Yet whenever she asked herself whether she had attained anything, the answer was always no. The distance between her ordinary daily life and the enlightenment she imagined remained impossibly wide. What she did not yet see was that the question, "Have I attained anything?" was itself the obstacle. It assumed a person who could keep or lose a spiritual prize. It assumed a before and an after, a seeker and a goal. But Zen does not begin there. It begins with this very moment, before the questioner has time to shape himself into a seeker. Chiono had spent so many years scaling the mountain that she had not noticed the mountain path was made of the same earth as her own feet. One evening, she was carrying water back to the temple in an old wooden bucket. The night was still, and the full moon floated on the surface of the water inside the bucket. She looked down and saw the moon trembling there. It was beautiful, perfectly round, caught in the small circle of the bucket's rim. She carried it carefully, not wanting to spill the reflection. Then, without warning, the bamboo hoop that held the bucket broke. The bottom fell out. The water rushed to the ground. The reflection of the moon vanished. In that sudden loss, something opened. Chiono looked at the empty bucket, the wet stones, the sky above her still holding the actual moon untouched. She saw that the reflection had never been the moon. The water had never contained it. Her own mind had been like that bucket, holding a trembling image of enlightenment and calling it real. When the bottom broke, there was no water, no moon, no separate self carrying either one, only the open sky and a clarity that did not need to be attained. This is the major pivot. The earlier stories taught Kenji to set down the stone, but Chiono's story goes further. There is no one to set it down. Hogan wanted Joshu to recognize him, but the one who wanted recognition was itself a reflection, a passing image made of memory and desire. The governor removed his titles at the gate, but the final title was the word I. and even that could not be carried through. This is not a philosophical metaphor in Zen. It is the core realization the tradition calls no self, or anatta. It does not mean a person has no value. It means the value is not locked inside a small, fixed, separate ego. This is not an idea imported from modern psychology. It is one of the oldest marks of existence, described in the Buddhist tradition, placed alongside impermanence and suffering. The early teachings analyze the human being into 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. None of these alone is the self. Each is changing, dependent on causes, and unable to stand as an unchanging owner of experience. When the mind looks for a permanent controller behind experience, it finds only a stream of passing events. The sense of a solid me is something the stream produces, like a whirlpool that appears to have a fixed shape while the water continues flowing. This recontextualizes everything that came before. Earlier, we saw Kenji struggle because his compassion hardened into a mission. He hardened because he believed there was a Kenji who must save the world. Hogan burned because he believed there was a Hogan who deserved recognition. The governor paused because he believed there was a governor who could enter the temple. But when the self is seen as a construct, the burden changes shape. It does not become lighter because the self has become stronger or better. It becomes lighter because the center that was doing the gripping is no longer solid enough to hold anything. This is a disturbing turn. If there is no fixed self, then the ordinary ways we try to improve ourselves, calm ourselves, or even fall asleep begin to look like strategies built on sand. You cannot relax a self that does not exist. You cannot fix a character that is always changing. You cannot carry the world if the one carrying it is only a thought. But this is where the tradition becomes most practical. The purpose of a Zen story is not to leave you with an idea of no self. It is to let the idea dissolve so that something more direct can appear. To understand this, consider the way a fish searches for water. A fish spends its entire life moving through water, breathing water, seeing through water. Yet the ancient analogy says the fish still asks, "Where is the ocean?" It searches because it cannot see what is always present. Our situation, according to Zen, is similar. We ask where peace is, where rest is, where the true self is, without noticing the awareness that has been present through every question. That awareness is not the restless self. It is not the one trying to sleep. It is the open space in which all those mental movements appear. The pivot is not the addition of a new fact. It is the recognition of what was never missing. What makes this pivot increase the stakes is that it removes every hiding place. Kenji could endure the stone and call it virtue. Hogan could become resentful and call it injustice. The governor could hesitate at the gate and call it dignity. But no self strips those labels away. If there is no fixed watcher, then there is no fixed hero, no fixed victim, no fixed authority. Everything is process, actions arising from causes, feelings passing through, identities forming and dissolving. The initial freedom is immense, but it is followed by a terrifying question. Without a solid self, who makes the next choice? Who loves? Who cares? If the answer is no one, then life seems meaningless. If the answer is something still acts, then the self we thought we were is not needed. Either way, the old security is gone. Zen does not answer this question philosophically. It throws the student back into ordinary life. After Chiono's awakening, she did not float above the ground. She swept floors, cooked rice, and carried water again. The difference was not in the activity, but in the absence of the one who was performing it for the sake of becoming something. The same action, washing a bowl, became complete in itself. This is the immediate fallout of the pivot. Everything is the same, and nothing is the same. The stories now begin to test whether the insight can survive contact with humiliation, false blame, illness, and death. Because if no self is only clear in quiet moments, it is not yet real. It must hold in the middle of ordinary suffering. That is why the journey cannot stop with Chiono. The next stories move from meditation cushions to accusations, from mountain quiet to public scandal. They ask what happens when the one who has seen through the small self is still accused of fathering a child, still confronted by a samurai demanding paradise, still challenged by a rival with supernatural powers. The pivot has opened a new kind of vulnerability. Before, the characters were protecting a self they thought was real. Now they must learn to live without that protection. The stakes are no longer merely psychological. They are the entire human body, its reputation, its dignity, and its death. But before we can enter those tests, we have to look more closely at the moment the bottom fell out, because the breaking of Chiono's bucket was not an accident. It was the result of long wear, of many journeys, of small cracks accumulating in the bamboo. In the same way, the mind's grip on the small self does not usually break all at once. It is worn down by repeated noticing, by stories that quietly contradict the self's assumptions, by nights when the body is too tired to keep up the performance. The bucket breaks when conditions are ready. Then the water spills, the moon disappears, and what remains is not a new self, but the open ground that was always there. That open ground is the true teacher of the following stories. It is not comfortable. It is liberating in a way that changes everything. And here is the high-tension bridge. If all this is true, then the very desire to use these videos to fall asleep can become another form of seeking. The mind may listen and think, I want that no self so I can finally rest. But the one who wants is still a reflection. So the teaching turns against the listener. It invites you to notice the watcher who is watching the watcher. It asks whether you can let the bottom of your bucket break without knowing what will be left. The next movement of the night will not offer reassurance. It will place the realization of no self directly into the fire of human conflict and ask whether it can burn without turning to ash. That is where we are now. The old interpretation that we must simply learn to let go of burdens has become incomplete. Letting go is not enough if the one who lets go remains. The new interpretation is more radical. Rest is not the achievement of a peaceful self. It is the recognition that the self is a passing reflection in a bucket. But like every reflection, it appears again unless the sky is seen. The following stories will keep pointing from the reflection to the sky, even when that pointing is unwelcome, even when it demands the loss of everything a person has used to hold herself together. The pivot has happened. The journey has changed. Now the only way forward is through the places where the false self is most likely to reappear. After the insight of no self entered the ordinary life of the monasteries, the first consequence was not peace. It was controversy. The teaching had always been disruptive, but now it began to move out of the meditation hall and into the villages, where reputation, family, money, and power could not be so easily set down. If there was no fixed self to protect, then what happened to duty, loyalty, or ordinary morality? If the self was a reflection in a bucket, then why should a person defend themselves against a false accusation? Why should a teacher guard his position? Why should anyone be trusted with authority? These questions were not theoretical. They began to play out in real disputes, and the tradition recorded them with unflinching honesty. The most famous case of this fallout belongs to the Japanese master Hakuin, who lived in the 17th and 18th centuries. Hakuin had already endured years of harsh training. He had experienced a severe spiritual crisis and come through it with a conviction that the Dharma had to be brought to ordinary people. He taught widely, attracting villagers, farmers, and samurai, as well as monks. That very openness made him vulnerable. A temple near the village where he taught had its own established authority. Some local families did not know what to make of a teacher who refused to wear his status heavily, who answered questions with silence or laughter, and who seemed indifferent to public opinion. That indifference was about to be tested. The story sees that a young, unmarried woman from a local family became pregnant. When her parents demanded to know who the father was, she named Hakuin. Perhaps she was afraid of a young man who would not be accepted. Perhaps she chose the least dangerous target. The historical record does not preserve her motive. What it preserves is the community's reaction. The parents marched to Hakuin and confronted him in front of others. They accused him of fathering the child. They called him a hypocrite, a fraud, a monk who preached purity while violating trust. The accusation spread quickly. Students who had sat at Hakuin's feet began to doubt him. Donations dropped. Other teachers distanced themselves. The scandal threatened to erase decades of work. Hakuin's response was not a defense. He did not deny the charge. He did not accuse the woman of lying. He did not produce witnesses or arguments. He simply said, "Is that so?" Then he accepted the child. The family, unwilling or unable to care for the baby, left it with him. Hakuin carried the infant through the village to find milk. He begged for food and clothing. He nursed the child at night when it cried. People pointed at him in the street. Some spat. Children called him names. His name became a curse in the village. He lost his position, his income, and the good opinion of nearly everyone who had once honored him. During that year he lived in poverty, moving from place to place with the baby, never once offering a public rebuttal. The story says he even wrote a short verse comparing the child to the moon, whose light does not depend on praise or blame. Then the truth surfaced. The young woman, unable to bear the weight of the lie any longer, confessed to her parents that Hakuin was not the father. She named another man. The family came to Hakuin in shame. They took the child back and asked for forgiveness. They wept and bowed. The villagers waited for Hakuin to be vindicated, for some sign of anger or relief. Again, Hakuin said only, "Is that so?" And he handed the child over. The first question had accepted the false accusation without resistance. The second accepted the correction without triumph. The self that would have demanded justice, or at least an apology, never appeared. The public fallout was enormous. Some people were deeply moved. They saw in Hakuin a living example of freedom from self-concern. Others were disturbed. If this was enlightenment, it looked too much like passivity. What about the woman? What about the real father? What about Hakuin's ruined year? The objection came not only from ordinary villagers but from religious teachers. They argued that refusing to defend oneself could encourage calumny, that accepting an accusation might be confused with admitting guilt, and that a religious figure had a duty to protect his reputation, so the Dharma would not be discredited. This was the first serious countermove. The radical teaching of no self began to face institutional resistance. That resistance did not come only in public scandal. It came in direct confrontation between teachers who represented different kinds of spiritual power. One of the sharpest examples involves Bankei, a Zen master known for his simple, direct teaching. Bankei had spent years in intense practice, nearly destroying his health. When he finally understood what he had been seeking, he discovered that it was not something spectacular. He began teaching ordinary people that the unborn wisdom of the mind was always present, that there was nothing to add or achieve. His teaching was so plain that it threatened the elaborate religious marketplace around him. A priest from another school once came to challenge Bankei. This priest claimed that his own tradition preserved supernatural powers. He spoke of founders who could write in the air, walk across water, or produce fire without fuel. The claim was meant to impress the crowd and expose Bankei as ordinary. The priest asked, "What miracle does your teaching perform?" The question was a trap. If Bankei claimed a miracle, he would be drawn into superstition. If he denied miracles, he would seem to lack spiritual power. But Bankei answered simply, "When I am hungry, I eat. When I am tired, I sleep." The crowd laughed. The priest was furious. Bankei went further. Ordinary people try to eat while planning 100 other things and sleep while wrestling with the day. They do not actually eat when hungry or sleep when tired. The true miracle, he said, was complete presence in the ordinary act. The conflict did not end there. The priest walked away humiliated, but he took with him a new line of attack. He began telling patrons that Bankei's teaching was too simple, that it made spiritual attainment meaningless, that it gave no visible sign of power. Some wealthy supporters withdrew. Other temples, whose authority depended on complex rituals and secret transmissions, saw Bankei as a dangerous leveler. The institutional pressure increased. Bankei was not accused of immorality, but he was accused of cheapening the Dharma. The resistance was quieter than Hakuin's scandal, but it cut deeper. It tried to define the no-self teaching as a kind of laziness, as permission to stop striving, as the end of reverence. And yet the tradition also recorded a different kind of fallout, one that took place in the body rather than in institutions. A samurai named Nobushige is said to have visited Hakuin and asked, "What is paradise? What is hell?" This was not a philosophical question. The samurai had lived by the sword. He wanted to know what awaited him after death, but he also carried the mind of a warrior. Hakuin looked at him and said, "Why should a fool like you deserve an answer?" Nobushige's pride ignited. He reached for his sword, his face hot with insult. Hakuin did not move. He said, "Here opens hell." The samurai froze. In that instant he felt the rage burning through him and saw how it had taken over his entire being. He released the sword, bowed, and began to weep. Hakuin said, "Here opens paradise." The difference was not in the afterlife. It was in the same man, the same moment, the same breath. This story shows why the no-self teaching was not simply a doctrine of passivity. Hakuin had not defended himself in the village because there had been no defensive self to protect. But when the samurai was about to strike, Hakuin did not stand aside in passivity. He pointed directly at the mental state that had arisen. He revealed the mechanism of hell and heaven in real time. The samurai's anger was not a fixed self, but a temporary formation that could dissolve as soon as it was seen. The pivot had become flesh. It was no longer an insight about identity. It was an event inside a nervous system. The countermove that emerged from these stories was not a single enemy. It was the slow institutionalization of the teachings themselves. After the first generations of radical awakening, monasteries began to compile and classify the koans. The spontaneous encounters between master and student were turned into a curriculum. A student could now progress through levels, pass tests, and gain certification. This was useful for preserving the tradition, but it also gave the small self a new way to reassert itself. A monk could now become a collector of koans, a holder of credentials, a performer of awakening. The same grasping that had been exposed in Hogan and the governor could reappear inside the very structure meant to dismantle it. That was the deepest fallout of the pivot. The teaching that said there is no fixed self began to be used as material for building a new spiritual self. The resistance had found its most subtle form. This is where the narrative turns. The public scandal, the institutional backlash, and the physical confrontation had all tested the insight. But the slow corruption of the teaching by the way it was taught and measured was more dangerous than any angry priest or scandalized villager. The following movement of the night will look at what happened when the insight was passed through the ordinary channels of human ambition and fear. It will ask whether the teaching could survive its own success and what that survival might cost. The line between liberation and performance had become very thin. The next story will force that line into the open, and the cost of crossing it will be far more intimate than any public accusation. The counter-move did not announce itself. It arrived with a knock, a polite bow, and a request for more teaching. The old master, Nanin, understood what that request concealed. A certain kind of student comes not to be emptied, but to be filled. The more he hears, the more he gathers, and the more he gathers, the more he becomes somebody who knows. Nanin received one such visitor, a professor of philosophy who had traveled a long way to ask about Zen. He spoke well. He cited books. He arranged his questions in elegant paragraphs. Nanin listened, then invited him to sit for tea. He placed a cup between them and began to pour. The tea rose to the rim. Nanin kept pouring. It spilled onto the tray. The professor watched, at first confused, then alarmed. He said, "Stop. The cup is full. No more will go in." Nanin set down the teapot and said, "Like this cup, you are full of your own ideas and opinions. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" The professor sat very still. He had not come to be accused of fullness. He had come to add Zen to the collection of things he already understood. That was the new sickness. The small self had learned to use the language of emptiness as another decoration. This was not an isolated encounter. The same pattern appeared in a student named Tenno, who arrived at a temple with the faint hope that a master would finally notice his seriousness. He had prepared his robes, his posture, his questions. He carried an umbrella, and he placed it carefully by the door. Nanin asked him a single question. "When you set down your umbrella, did you put it to the left or the right of your shoes?" Tenno could not answer. The question was not about the umbrella. It was about presence. A man who did not know where he placed his own belongings had not been where he thought he was. He had been rehearsing himself instead of living the moment. The cost of that rehearsal was immense, though invisible at first. He had traded the direct world for an image of himself in that world. The tradition began to name this condition. Some called it Zen sickness. It appeared when a student took the insights of the masters and rebuilt a self around them. The very teachings that were meant to dissolve the official, the hungry, the seeking self became raw material for a new identity. A monk could now become an expert in letting go without ever letting go. A teacher could become famous for humility without being humble. A student could recite from memory the words of an old master and feel that recognition had been achieved. The danger was not that people failed to understand. The danger was that they understood intellectually and then moved on, believing the understanding itself was the awakening. The outer consequences were not long in coming. The koan, which had once been a living encounter between two people, slowly became a list. The cases were collected, arranged, and assigned. A trainee could now progress through levels, give the expected answers, and receive a document of transmission. That document was useful. It preserved lineages. It allowed laypeople to identify authorized teachers. But it also gave the small self a new kind of currency. Awakening could be stamped, sealed, and carried like an identity card. The line between a spiritual certificate and a worldly credential became very thin. This was not the fault of any single teacher. It was the result of a tradition trying to survive in the world of institutions, patrons, and government oversight. To see the inner form of that danger, the old stories turned to a man who could not stop becoming someone else. A stone cutter worked in a quarry, swinging a heavy tool into hot stone. He was mostly content until he saw a wealthy merchant pass by in a palanquin. The stone cutter thought, "If only I were that merchant, I would be truly happy." His longing grew so strong that the mountain spirit granted the change. Suddenly, he was the merchant, carried in comfort, surrounded by servants. But before long, he noticed the heat of the sun pressing down on him. He wished to be the sun. The wish was granted. As the sun, he burned the fields, but a cloud passed across his face and dimmed his power. He wished to be the cloud. The wish was granted. As the cloud, he drifted and rained, but the wind pushed him across the sky. He wished to be the wind. The wish was granted. As the wind, he tore through trees until he came to a mountain that would not move. He wished to be the mountain. The wish was granted. As the mountain, he was massive and unmovable. Then he felt a small, sharp pain in his flanks. A stone cutter was cutting into him. He wished to be the stone cutter again, and the whole wheel came to rest where it had begun. This story is not a children's fable about gratitude. It is a precise diagram of the self. Each transformation seemed to solve the previous problem. Each solution produced a new narrowness, a new dissatisfaction. The stone cutter never became nothing. He only became something else. The real freedom would have come not from changing the self, but from seeing that the one who wanted to change was the same at every station. This is the wider consequence the old teachers were trying to expose. When spiritual practice becomes another project of self-improvement, it feeds the same machine it claims to stop. At the same time, another image appeared in the teaching. A fish in the ocean asking where the ocean is. The story says that a great and bewildered fish swam in every direction, asking all the other creatures for help. "I have heard of the ocean," she said. "I have studied it. I have journeyed far to find it. Can you tell me where it is?" The other creatures laughed, because she was already surrounded by water, breathing water, moving through water. The fish could not see it because it was too close. This is the other side of the sickness. One self tries to acquire the teaching as an object. Another self searches for the teaching as if it were somewhere else. Both miss the fact that the ocean has never been outside. It is the very substance of every question, every search, every moment of confusion or clarity. The fish does not need to find the ocean. It needs to notice what it is already swimming in. These stories were not told to comfort the monks. They were told to break a particular kind of pride. And the pride was growing, because Zen had become successful. Temples received gifts. Masters attracted students. The state wanted recognized schools. The merchants wanted teachers who could bless their ventures. The samurai wanted spiritual assurance before battle. In that social world, being an enlightened person was valuable. So the small self dressed itself in the robes of no self. It did not look like greed or ambition. It looked like sincerity, seriousness, and placement of the umbrella. The counterfeit was almost perfect. Hakuin, the same master who had once accepted a false accusation with the words, "Is that so?" saw this danger within his own success. He had revitalized koan practice, but he also criticized those who treated it as a ladder to be climbed for status. He wrote about the illness of the mind and body that came from wrong effort. He told students to take care of their physical health, to balance intense meditation with ordinary work and food. He knew that the realization of no self was not an idea to be inhabited. It was a natural state that required a living human body, not a performer. But the system he helped create had already begun to move beyond his control. The wider consequences spread through the monasteries and into the villages. Some monks became depressed because they could not produce the enlightened experience they had heard described. Others became arrogant because they believed they had. A third group simply went through the motions, giving the correct answer without any living heat behind it. The laypeople often could not tell the difference. They saw a teacher who spoke well, who wore the right robes, who had the right certificate. The teaching survived, but the fragrance of the living thing grew faint. This was worse than a scandal. A scandal could be denied or forgiven. A counterfeit could not easily be exposed because it used the very words of truth. And yet there was a saving agitation in the old stories. They kept pointing back to ordinary life, to the motion of carrying water, chopping wood, eating rice, placing shoes. They kept asking the fish to notice the water. They kept pouring tea over the rim of the cup. The cost of ignoring these small things was not dramatic. It was only the quiet loss of the one thing the seeker had been trying to find. The problem was larger than any single teacher or institution because it was located in the very structure of wanting. As long as the mind wanted to become something, even something called awakened, it would find a way to carry the stone again. The next turn would have to go even closer to the root. The actors could not see that the root was not in the institution. It was in the watcher that watched the institution and called it good or bad. That watcher was the last, most intimate form of the burden, and it was about to be tested in ways none of them expected. The decisive turn had left the old teaching exposed, not as a failure, but as something more unsettling, a mirror that showed the seeker his own face and then asked him to look behind it. In the days and years after such realizations spread beyond the monasteries, the first consequence was not a grand collapse. It was a quiet clarification of what the practice had always been for. The masters began to say openly that enlightenment was not a state to be achieved. It was the absence of the one who believed he was failing to achieve it. That phrase sounded simple, but it carried enormous weight. People had come to the temples expecting transformation. They left with the question, if there is no separate self, then who sleeps? Who wakes? Who suffers? Who rests? And the answer, when it came, was not a person. It was a process. To see why this matters for the simple act of falling asleep, we have to look at what actually keeps a human being awake. It is not just noise, caffeine, or an overactive schedule. It is the sense of being a self that must manage those things. The moment you lie down and try to sleep, that self takes the attempt as a task. It checks the body. It reviews the day. It compares tonight to other nights. It calculates how many hours remain before the morning. It becomes a watcher, standing just outside the body, demanding that the body perform rest. That watcher is the small self described in all these stories. It cannot let go, because letting go feels like disappearing. And in a certain sense, it is. The fear of that disappearance is the deepest reason the watcher keeps us awake. The old Buddhist psychology recognized this not as a modern anxiety disorder, but as the root of all suffering, the identification with a manager who is never off duty. The resolution of the stories therefore moves in two directions at once. First, they show the watcher that it is not the true owner of experience. The watcher is a passing thought, a mental function, not an unchanging self. Second, they point toward a different way of living, not managing experience from a distance, but being the experience directly. When Kenji finally set down both the stone and the one who carried it, he did not become indifferent to the world. He became available to it. When Hogan stopped demanding recognition, he did not become invisible. He became present enough to help without needing applause. When the governor passed through the gate without his title, he did not cease to be a leader. He became one who could act without being trapped inside the role. These are not separate achievements. They are the same underlying shift described from different angles. The classical word for that shift is prajna, often translated as wisdom or direct insight. Prajna is not cleverness. It is the immediate seeing of things as they are, before the mind adds labels, judgments, and the shadow of a manager. In the Zen tradition, this seeing is compared to a mirror. A mirror reflects whatever appears without holding it. It does not say, "I am a good mirror because that is a beautiful face," or "I am a bad mirror because that is a cracked cup." It simply reflects. The human mind, when it is not solidified into a separate self, functions in a similar way. Thoughts appear. Sensations arise. The body breathes. But there is no mirror owner standing behind the mirror, polishing it or worrying about its quality. There's only the open space of awareness, already peaceful, already whole. This is why the night became a teacher. Sleep is not something the manager can produce. It is what happens when the manager steps aside and the body is allowed to do what it already knows. The tired body does not need to be commanded into rest. The overactive self is the only obstacle. When the stories loosen that self, even for a moment, the breathing deepens, the jaw unclenches, the shoulders drop. The medicine is not in the plot. It is in the space the story opens. A koan works because it bypasses the analytical manager and leaves the mind momentarily empty. In that emptiness, the natural repair of the body and nervous system can begin. This is not magic. It is the observable consequence of shifting attention from the constructed self to the simple fact of being alive. The tradition also made a practical distinction between two phases of this shift. The first is the initial glimpse. A student hears a story, or sits long enough, and for a moment the self-construction weakens. The bottom falls out of the bucket. There's a flash of clarity, often followed by tears or laughter. But the old patterns return. The manager returns and says, "I had a glimpse. How do I get it back?" That is the false self reasserting itself through the very memory of its own absence. The second phase is the long integration of the glimpse into ordinary life. It is not a dramatic enlightenment. It is the gradual wearing down of the habit of identifying with every thought, every emotion, every task. In this phase, the koans are not hidden answers to be solved. They are weights that keep the mind from floating back into its usual pretensions. The old teachers said it could take a lifetime, sometimes several. Hakuin, who had survived false accusation and public disgrace, spent his later years trying to prevent this integration from becoming another form of performance. He gave direct instruction to lay people, wrote letters to ailing students, and warned against the kind of meditation that turned the body into an enemy. He knew from his own experience that intense practice could damage the nervous system. The same striving that produced insight could also produce illness. So he recommended attention to the breath, to the lower belly, to the actual warmth and weight of the body. He told practitioners to eat when hungry, rest when tired, and stop treating enlightenment as a trophy. In doing so, he brought the teaching back to the ordinary life that had been its original foundation. The larger consequences of that return were not confined to temples. The stories spread into the culture. They became part of how ordinary people thought about work, loss, shame, and death. A farmer could understand the stone. A merchant could understand the full cup. A soldier could understand the moment between rage and release. The teaching survived not because it was preserved in institutions, but because it addressed a universal human experience, the exhaustion of trying to be somebody all the time. The promise of deep rest lay not in achieving a new state, but in recognizing that the one who was exhausted was itself a construction. When the construction relaxed, the energy that had been wasted on self-maintenance returned to the body. That energy became warmth, heaviness, softening, and eventually sleep. Still, there is an honest uncertainty in the record. The stories were passed down through generations, often edited, sometimes combined, never dated with modern precision. We cannot say with certainty that Hakuin spoke the exact words attributed to him, or that Chiono existed as a single historical figure. What we can say is that the tradition used these stories for a specific purpose, and that purpose is still legible. The teachings were tested against actual human experience, not against a laboratory. They survived because they worked, not because they were easy. The uncertainty about their origins does not weaken their use. It actually heightens their function. They are not news reports. They are mirrors. You do not ask a mirror whether it is fact-checked. You ask what it shows. And here we begin to close the central question raised in the opening. How can words from centuries ago loosen the grip of a sleepless mind? By revealing that the grip is not held by the real you. The night is not an enemy. The body is not a machine that has failed. The mind is not a problem to be solved. The suffering that keeps us awake comes from the effort to control what cannot be controlled, the flow of thought, the passage of time, the necessity of letting go. The stories do not remove that flow. They change the relationship to it. They invite the listener to stop standing outside the flow and to fall into the water that has always been carrying her. The fish that was looking for the ocean did not need to find it. She needed to notice that she was already wet. This is the resolution of the major narrative loops. The burden Kenji carried was not the world. It was his constructed identity as the world's savior. The recognition Hogan sought was not from Joshu. It was from his own imagined audience. The governor's rank was not a title to be discarded. It was a costume that had fused to his face. The woman's accusation against Hakuin was not a legal problem to be litigated. It was a test of whether the self that needed to be right could remain silent. Bankei's eating and sleeping were not laziness. They were the full presence that most busy minds never taste. The stonecutter's endless transformations were not progress. They were the wheel of a self that would rather become anything than face its own emptiness. The fish's search was not a journey. It was the missing of the obvious. Each loop closes on the same note. Rest is not found by adding something. It is uncovered by seeing through something. Yet there is one loop that remains open, and it must remain open until the final turn. It is the loop of the listener. As this narration speaks, a part of the mind is still listening for the next instruction. It wants to know how to apply all this. It wants a method, a step, a guarantee. That part is the watcher, doing what it has always done. The instruction is not to fight that watcher. That would only create another watcher who fights. The instruction is to notice it. Notice that there is awareness of the watcher. That awareness is not tired. It is not anxious. It is not trying to sleep. It is simply present, like the sky behind the moon. When attention rests there, even briefly, the watcher loses its authority. The body follows. The breath deepens. The night becomes accessible. This is the payoff that the old stories were always driving toward. Not a dramatic finale, but a silent rearrangement of the listener's inner world. The mind that came to the documentary looking for technique leaves with something simpler. The technique, if there is one, is to see that no technique is needed. The body already knows how to sleep. The heart already knows how to release. The awareness already knows how to rest. The only obstacle was the belief that there was a separate someone who had to do it correctly. That belief is the stone, the cup, the umbrella, the title, the reflection. Let it be. What remains is the final turn, the last surprising detail that will come in the closing movement. It has to do with the ancient saying about an original face. The Zen tradition asks, "What did your face look like before your parents were born?" The question is not about biology. It is about the self before it became a self-image. In the deepest part of the night, when the body is soft and the watcher is silent, that original face is not far away. It is the simple fact of awareness without a mirror. It is the one who has been breathing all along, not as a manager, but as the breath itself. The final movement will bring this to rest. But for now, let the opening of these stories do its quiet work. The night is no longer a problem. It is a companion. The night is no longer a problem. It is a companion. But a companion of what kind? Not a presence outside you, not a force that must be bargained with or managed. The night is the natural stillness that has always been underneath the day's movement. The stories have not created that stillness. They have only removed, one by one, the small, tight objects that were laid on top of it. The stone Kenji carried was not the world. The cup Nanen overfilled was not the tea. The reflection Chiono lost was not the moon. Each story pointed through the object to the open space that contains the object. That open space is the companion. It does not come and go. It is what remains when the watching mind grows quiet. There is one final strand in the old tradition, and it is called direct transmission. The name sounds formal, but it points to something very simple. It is the passing of insight from one awareness to another without relying on doctrine. The root story is not complicated. The Buddha is said to have stood before an assembly of monks and held up a single flower. No commentaries, no explanation. Most of the gathering waited for words that did not come. Only one disciple, Mahakashyapa, smiled. And in that quiet exchange, the tradition says, the living heart of the Dharma was handed over. It was not a secret. It was not a magic formula. It was recognition. The disciple did not smile because he understood a new philosophy. He smiled because he had seen the flower for the first time, without the mind reaching past it for a lesson. That is the transmission we have been circling all night. A story is a flower held up in sound. You can study its petals. You can demand its meaning. Or you can sit with it until the effort drops, and the flower is simply there. The old masters did not teach in order to build a better explanation. They taught in order to spark that direct seeing. When Bankei said he ate when hungry and slept when tired, he was holding up a flower. When Hakuin answered an accusation with, "Is that so?" he was holding up a flower. When Nanin kept pouring tea over the rim, he was holding up a flower. The listener may be tempted to turn each one into a lesson, but the deeper invitation is to stop and see. The seeing is already present. It is not added by the story. Now, the final teaching of the night comes not from a famous master in a mountain temple. It comes from an old woman named Chio, who lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of a village. She had raised her children, cared for her husband until his death, and helped neighbors through decades of ordinary joy and sorrow. Every morning, she sat on her wooden porch before dawn, listening to the first birds, feeling the air change, watching the light come over the mountains. She was not a teacher. She was not a nun. She was simply someone who had learned to be where she was. One morning, a young monk appeared on the path before her cottage. He was traveling quickly, his face lined with frustration. He bowed and asked whether there were any enlightened teachers in the area. He said he had studied many texts and practiced many techniques. He had walked for days. He wanted someone who could show him how to achieve liberation from suffering. Chio looked at him with unhurried kindness. Instead of giving directions to another temple, she invited him to sit on the porch step beside her. He hesitated. He was in a hurry, but something in her stillness made him pause, and he sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning opened around them. A small bird landed near their feet. The monk watched it peck at the ground and then fly away. Chio asked, "What do you think that bird knows that you do not know?" The monk almost laughed. He said it was only instinct. The bird had no teaching, no practice, no understanding. Chio did not argue. She gestured toward the garden, the rows of vegetables, the light shifting through the branches. She said, "When I eat these vegetables, am I experiencing the nature of reality?" The monk wanted to say no. That was ordinary life. He was looking for something much deeper, but the words felt heavy in his mouth. He was sitting in a place more peaceful than he had felt in months, and he could not say exactly why. That is when the old woman gave him the final teaching, though she did not call it a teaching. She told him he seemed tired from searching. She said the morning was his teacher. The bird was his teacher. The breath was his teacher. She pointed out that in this moment, he was not suffering. He was not confused about the nature of reality. He was simply there, breathing, seeing, listening. The monk realized that he had spent years climbing mountains to find something that was already sitting in his own chest. He had wanted a special state, a remarkable experience, a certificate that said he had arrived. But peace had been offering itself in the simplest possible way, and he had kept walking past it. This is the resolution the hook promised. The 3 hours of stories were never going to manufacture rest. Rest was always present. The stories only loosened the grip of the one who could not accept that. The old woman did not give the monk a technique. She gave him her own presence, and in that presence, his own presence became visible. This is the direct transmission, not from authority to student, but from attention to attention. The teacher is not a person who gives you something new. The teacher is the one who points you back to what has been there all along. Sometimes the teacher is a master. Sometimes the teacher is an old woman. Sometimes the teacher is a bird on the porch step. The unusual thing about Chio's story is that she never made a single grand claim. She did not perform a miracle. She did not answer a koan. She simply allowed the morning to be exactly what it was. The monk later told his own students about the encounter. He did not say, "I found an enlightened master." He said, "The greatest teacher I ever met was an old woman who taught me nothing and gave me everything." That paradox is the last surprise of the night. In a tradition famous for its fierce masters and impossible questions, the final guidance came from someone with no title, no temple, no public record. The most profound instruction was not hidden in a distant monastery. It was sitting on a wooden porch at the edge of an ordinary village. That detail changes the meaning of everything that came before. We began with Kenji, a young monk collapsing under the weight of the world. We saw Hogan's hunger for recognition. We followed the governor to the gate, Chiono to the broken bucket, Hakuin into scandal, Bankei into simplicity, and the fish in search of the ocean. Each story seemed to feature a special person in a special setting, but the final story quietly erases the distance between the seeker and the sought. The old woman was not special. The village was not sacred. The morning was not exceptional. And yet the whole teaching was present there. This is why the master Rinzai is said to have told his students that wherever they stood was the site of enlightenment. The ordinary is not a barrier to the sacred. It is the sacred, wearing plain clothes. At the edge of sleep, this becomes very practical. You do not need to become a monk. You do not need to reproduce the intensity of the old monasteries. You do not need to solve a koan or be recognized by a teacher. You only need to notice what Chio noticed. The body is already heavy. The breath is already moving. The sounds of the room are already coming and going. The night is already holding you. The watcher that wants to sleep is not separate from the sleep it wants. It is a wave in the same water. Let the wave settle. Let the bottom fall out of the bucket. The moon does not disappear. It only stops being confined to the small circle of water. There is a question the tradition asks when all other questions have been exhausted. What did your face look like before your parents were born? It is not a question about biology. It is a question about the self before it became an image. The face before your parents were born is not a memory. It is the awareness that is looking out of your eyes right now, before you add the story of who you are. It is the original face, soft and unguarded, the face you may have worn as a child, before the world taught you to manage every expression. Sleep is close when that original face is allowed to surface. The face does not need to be earned. It only needs the muscles of the face and the muscles of the heart to let go. The old woman Chio was not named in some of the oldest records. Her name may have been added later, or her story may have been shaped by generations of retelling. The tradition does not mind. The point was not to preserve a biography. The point was to preserve a mirror. In that mirror, the young monk saw himself as he already was. not as a seeker who needed to become something else. In the same way, these stories have been holding up a mirror to you. The images of Kenji, Hogan, Hakuen, Bankei, and Chiono are not characters to admire from a distance. They are movements inside your own mind. The stone is the worry you carry into bed. The full cup is the mind so busy that it cannot receive rest. The bucket is the desperate effort to hold on to a reflection. The flower is the simple moment you keep missing. The final movement is not a teaching, it is a return. The stories have done their work. Now they can be laid down. A boat is useful for crossing a river, but it is foolish to carry the boat up the far shore. The koans, the parables, the old women and masters, the buckets and cups and stones, all of them are boats. They carried you across the restless water, but now you are on the other side. The shore is not a dreamscape. It is the real, quiet ground of this very moment. The body knows it. The breath knows it. The awareness that has been listening knows it. There is no more need to search. There's no more need to perform sleep. Sleep will come not as an achievement, but as a natural settling, like water finding its level, like a bird folding its wings, like the old woman going inside after the morning has fully come. So, if the mind still asks what to do, let the question be there without answering it. Feel the weight of the blanket. Notice the small sounds in the room, the distant hum, the movement of air, the slow rhythm of the chest. Each of these is a teacher. Each is a flower held up in the dark. You do not have to reach for anything. The current of life is already carrying you. The trust the old tradition speaks of is not trust in some faraway power. It is trust in the natural intelligence of the body and the vast, open awareness that has never once left you. That trust is the last loosening. It is the final unclasping of the hand that thought it had to hold everything. And here is the last surprise, fully opened. The old woman did not teach the young monk how to sleep, how to meditate, or how to attain liberation. She taught him that he was already home. The only reason he could not rest was that he was looking for a home elsewhere. The same is true for you. The peace of these ancient stories is not in the past. It is not in Japan or China or a remote mountain temple. It is here, in the simple presence that hears these words. It has no title. It has no face. It has no need to become anything. When the mind drops into that presence, even for a few seconds, the whole body unwinds. The night becomes not something to get through, but something to be inside. And inside that night, there's no problem, no seeker, no separate self. There's only the soft fact of being alive, breathing, and letting go into the dark. And yet, even now, as the last of the story settles into the background, a quiet paradox remains. The very attention you brought to these words was both the obstacle and the doorway. The mind wanted to understand. It wanted to store these parables, compare them, place them somewhere useful. That is what the mind does. But the deeper part of you, the part that has been listening beneath the words, was never trying to understand. It was only waiting for the narration to become soft enough, familiar enough, steady enough, to allow the body to let go. This is the paradox at the center of every Zen story. The more directly you grasp it, the more it slips away. The more you let it wash over you, the more it can do its real work. The work itself is older than any single tradition. Long before the first Zen monastery, human beings gathered around firelight and used rhythmic speech to soothe one another into rest. The storyteller's voice was never only information. It was a carrier wave of presence. A parent murmuring in the dark, a healer reciting lineage, a monk retelling a koan. All of them were doing the same thing. They were not teaching a lesson. They were creating a space in which the nervous system could recognize that it was safe. Modern sleep science now speaks of this in its own language. The reduction of hyperarousal, the downshift of the sympathetic nervous system, the gradual withdrawal of prefrontal control. But the felt reality is much simpler. A voice that does not demand anything from you allows the watchman to leave his post. That watchman is not your enemy. He was never a villain. He came into existence to protect you from danger, from shame, from the 1,000 small failures that taught you to stay alert. The tragedy is that he has never learned how to lay down his spear. The Zen tradition would say he is not actually a person at all, but a pattern with no owner. The more you fight him, the more solid he becomes. The more you notice him without comment, the more transparent he grows. This is why your own awareness is more restful than any instruction. The awareness is not trying to fix the watchman. It simply sees him. In that seeing, the grip softens. The watchman becomes a passing cloud, and the sky, always the sky, remains unmoved. What remains after these stories is not a set of ideas. It is a certain quality of inner weather. You may not remember every detail. You may not recall whether it was Kenji or Hogan who carried the stone, whether it was Hakuen or Bankei who was accused, whether it was Chiono or Chio who saw the moon vanish. The mind will not hold all of it, but the body will remember the rhythm. The body will remember what it felt like to stop solving for a few minutes. That memory is more durable than any doctrine. It is the real inheritance of the tradition, not the words, but the atmosphere the words create when they are allowed to fall like rain on the roof of an old temple. There is a phrase in some Buddhist texts: the teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. The whole purpose of the finger is not to be studied, but to direct the gaze beyond itself. For 3 hours these stories have been fingers. Some of them were weathered and crooked. Some were unexpected. An old woman on a porch, a bucket breaking in the dark. But all of them pointed in the same direction. They pointed away from the one who thinks he must do something, and toward the one who is already here. That one does not need to be fixed. It does not need to be put to sleep. It is already the sleep itself, the vast quiet behind all noise, the natural dropping of effort. Yet there is one unresolved tension that cannot be fully closed, and it should not be. The moment you decide, I have understood this, the small self has returned. The moment you think, now I can finally rest, the watcher is back on duty. The old teachers knew this. They did not try to eliminate it. They simply learned to recognize it more quickly. Liberation is not a permanent state with no further struggle. It is a new relationship with the struggle. The stone may be picked up again. The cup may fill again. The reflection may reappear. But once the mechanism has been seen, it cannot hold the same authority. You may still have wakeful nights, anxious mornings, days when the old burden settles on your chest. The difference is that you no longer believe the burden belongs to a solid, separate self who carries it alone. It is weather, and weather passes. This is the legacy of those ancient mountain paths. They did not lead to a place where no one suffers. They led to a way of suffering that no longer adds a second wound. The first wound is pain. The second wound is the self that says, I am the one who is in pain, and something is wrong with me. The stories have been gently removing that second wound. Kenji's exhaustion was not his enemy. His belief that he alone had to save the world was the enemy. Hogan's longing was not his enemy. His demand to be recognized was. The governor's rank was not his enemy. His fusion with it was. The teaching is not about becoming less human. It is about becoming less haunted by the image of being human. In the final minutes of this long night, the invitation is no longer to listen. It is to rest in the listening that has been there all along. Let the next words be only sound. Let the meaning become less important than the tone. The body has already begun its descent. The breath has already grown longer. The small movements of the face, the hands, the belly have already softened. You do not need to hold this state. You do not need to prolong it. You only need to allow it to be exactly as it is. If sleep comes before the final sentence, then the work is complete. If wakefulness remains, then let it remain without fighting. The night is wide enough for both. The Zen tradition ends many of its deepest teachings with a single image. The moon does not try to be reflected in the water. The water does not try to hold the moon. But when the water is still, the reflection appears by itself. Rest is like that. The body is the water. The mind is the moon. The stillness is not pushed into the body. It arises when the pushing stops. The water has no ambition to become calm. It becomes calm when the wind stops stirring it. You are the water, and the wind has been the effort to be someone who sleeps correctly. Let the wind rest. The moon is still there. If this journey has brought you even a little closer to that stillness, then it has done what it was meant to do. These stories are here for you on other nights as well. They are not used up by one listening. Like old friends, they return with new meaning as your own life changes. If you would like to walk this path again, you are welcome to join Sleepy Monk. Subscribe so that when the next sleepless hour arrives, a gentle voice will already be waiting for you. Share these stories with someone who is tired of carrying what they cannot put down. But whether or not you return, the peace you touched tonight is not in a video. It is in the awareness that has been listening all along. That awareness is yours completely. So as this final breath of narration fades, let the instructions fall away. You are not a task to be completed. You are not a problem to be solved. You are the open, breathing space in which this entire night has happened. Let the blanket hold you. Let the dark be warm. Sleep is not a place you must reach. It is a friend who has been waiting for you to stop trying. Good night, and rest as the still water receives the moon.